What if your own government secretly entered your mind without your permission? What if the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth spent 20 years trying to erase who you are and rebuild you from nothing? What if the people they experimented on were never told it was happening, never signed anything, never had any idea? And what if, when investigators finally got close to the truth, the government shredded every single document before anyone could read them? Here is the part that should make you stop and think. They almost got away with it completely. We only know what we know today because of one misfiled box sitting in the wrong records room. One box out of thousands. That is the only reason this story exists. That is how close the truth came to disappearing forever. If you have never heard the full story of MKUltra, stay with us, because what you are about to hear is not a conspiracy theory. It is a confirmed, government-admitted program, and it is far worse than anything you have imagined. Subscribe to Lost Beyond Sight right now, because this channel exists to tell you exactly the stories that powerful people have spent decades trying to bury. It begins in 1953. The Cold War is alive and suffocating. American intelligence officials receive reports that United States soldiers returning from North Korean prison camps are behaving in ways that make no sense. They are unnaturally calm. They recite communist ideology word for word as if reading from a script. They look like the same men who left, but something inside them has been altered in a way that no one can explain. The CIA becomes convinced that the Soviet Union has developed a method to control the human mind. They call it brain warfare, and the fear of it pushes them to do something that would take 20 years to come to light. On April 13, 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles signs the authorization for a classified program. He does not call it research, he calls it a weapon. The program is codenamed MKUltra. Its goal, written in internal documents, is to find a method to produce a robot agent, a human being whose memory, loyalty, and free will can be completely overwritten by someone else. The man assigned to build this weapon is a soft-spoken government chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. He keeps goats on a farm in Virginia. He meditates. He seems harmless. He is the most dangerous man in this story. Here is the first fact that should stop you cold. Before MKUltra ran a single experiment of its own, the CIA recruited scientists who had conducted human experiments inside Nazi concentration camps and Imperial Japanese torture facilities. Men whose work had been classified as war crimes at Nuremberg. The United States government did not prosecute them, it hired them. It used their findings as the scientific foundation for MKUltra. The program was not built from curiosity. It was built on atrocities that had already been committed on human beings who had no choice. And this was only the beginning. The program needed human beings to test on, not volunteers, not informed participants, people who could be used without their knowledge and who had no power to resist or report what was done to them. The CIA went to prisons, psychiatric hospitals, and homeless shelters. They selected people from the edges of society, people who were invisible. A CIA officer later described the selection process in a way that is almost impossible to process as a real statement made by a real government official. He said they chose people who could not fight back. The primary weapon was LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide. Colorless, odorless, invisible in a glass of water. A dose smaller than a grain of sand could shatter a person's sense of reality for 12 hours or more. The CIA believed that if they could understand exactly how LSD dismantled the mind's defenses, they could engineer the ultimate tool for interrogation, confession, and reprogramming. Here is a shocking fact that most people have never heard. Sidney Gottlieb did not obtain LSD through normal research channels. He contacted the Swiss pharmaceutical company Sandoz, which had synthesized the drug, and he purchased their entire global supply, every single gram available on Earth, the equivalent of over $4 million in today's money. This was not curiosity. This was preparation for mass use. One of the most documented victims of this phase was a young prisoner in a federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Georgia. His name was James Whitey Bulger. He was told he was volunteering to help find a cure for schizophrenia. He agreed. What followed was repeated LSD dosing over more than a year. Bulger later left a written account. He described rooms collapsing and reshaping around him. He described watching other prisoners transform into skeletons. He wrote about seeing blood running down the walls and a camera turning into the head of a dog. He wrote the words, "I felt like I was going insane." And then he paused in his account, and he added one more line. He wrote, "I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me." Bulger was not the extreme case. He was average by MKUltra standards. In a psychiatric facility in Kentucky, one patient was given LSD every single day for 174 consecutive days. In another documented case, 7 Black American men in a CIA-funded research center were dosed daily for 77 straight days. Researchers noted their psychological deterioration with clinical detachment and continued the experiment. Nobody stopped it, nobody questioned it. The documentation shows that the results were simply recorded and filed. These were not accidents. They were systematic attempts to find the breaking point of the human mind. And what they discovered at that breaking point was something the program was not fully prepared for. By the mid-1950s, Sidney Gottlieb wanted something the prison experiments could not give him. He wanted to observe the effects of LSD on completely ordinary people in completely natural environments. People who had no idea anything was happening to them. People who were relaxed, unguarded, and behaving as they normally would. To accomplish this, the CIA created something so extraordinary in its criminality that it reads like fiction, even with the documents in front of you. They built a brothel, and then they turned it into a surveillance laboratory. The operation was called Operation Midnight Climax. The CIA purchased a furnished apartment at 225 Chestnut Street in San Francisco. A federal narcotics officer named George Hunter White was assigned to run it under the false identity of Morgan Hall. The CIA paid sex workers to bring men back to the apartment. Once those men were inside and had accepted a drink, they were unknowingly given LSD. Behind the wall of the main room was a hidden chamber where CIA agents sat with notebooks, recording equipment, and a one-way mirror. They watched everything. They took notes. They did this to ordinary American civilians over and over for nearly 10 years. Here is the fact about this operation that is most difficult to absorb. When George Hunter White retired from the program and wrote a farewell letter to Sidney Gottlieb, he described his years running Midnight Climax as some of the best of his life. He used the word fun. He described the systematic drugging of non-consenting civilians and called it operating with the sanction and blessing of the All-Highest. These men did not believe they had crossed a moral line. They believed they had been placed above moral lines entirely. The operation expanded. Similar safe houses operated in New York City and Marin County, California. Beyond the safe houses, the CIA secretly funded research at more than 30 American universities and hospitals through a network of fake charitable foundations. Scientists at Columbia University, Stanford University, and other respected institutions received grants they believed were legitimate. Many of them never knew who was funding their work or why. The entire financial system of MKUltra was constructed to make the CIA invisible inside it. And through every phase of every experiment, Sidney Gottlieb remained focused on one belief: that somewhere inside human brain chemistry was a switch, a point of control that once found would allow one person to completely override the free will of another. He had not found it, but something was about to happen inside the program that would permanently change the direction of everything. Something that began with a bottle of liqueur at a quiet cabin retreat and ended 9 days later on a sidewalk in New York City. His name was Frank Olson, 43 years old, Army bacteriologist, father of 3. He had worked for years on classified biological research at a government facility in Maryland. He was a careful man, a private man, a man who understood that his work existed inside a world where certain things could never be spoken about openly. But in November of 1953, Frank Olson learned something that the CIA could not allow him to carry out into the world. And 9 days later, he was dead. On November 19, 1953, Olson attended a professional retreat with a group of CIA and Army scientists at a remote cabin in the Maryland countryside. On the first evening, Sidney Gottlieb dissolved LSD into a bottle of Cointreau liqueur and served it to the group without telling anyone what was in it. 20 minutes later, he informed them. The drug was already working. For most of the men, the experience was disturbing but temporary. For Frank Olson, it cracked something open that never closed again. He returned home to his family a different person. His wife noticed within hours. He sat at the dinner table and did not eat. He did not speak. He stared at the wall with eyes that seemed to be looking at something that was not in the room. He told her quietly, in a voice she later described as completely unlike his own, that he had made a terrible mistake. He could not tell her what the mistake was. The days that followed were a descent. He could not sleep. He could not concentrate. He showed signs of severe paranoia at work. Colleagues reported that he seemed frightened of something he refused to name. Here is the fact that investigators found most significant decades later. In the days before his death, Olson had reportedly expressed serious moral doubts about CIA human experimentation programs. He had seen things in his classified work, including alleged field tests of biological and chemical agents, that he could not reconcile with his conscience. The CIA was aware of his psychological state. They were also aware of what he knew. He was taken to New York City under the supervision of a CIA-connected psychiatrist. They checked in to the Hotel Statler on the night of November 27, 1953. They were given a room on the 13th floor. At approximately 2 in the morning on November 28th, Frank Olson went through the window of that room. He hit the sidewalk below and died on impact. The CIA told his family it was a suicide, a breakdown. They were given almost no information. His wife and children buried him and carried the grief of that explanation for over 20 years. Then, in 1975, a government investigation exposed the secret LSD dosing. His family was told the truth. They received a formal apology from President Ford and a financial settlement. But the story did not end there. In 1994, Olson's body was exhumed for forensic examination. The pathologist who examined him found a deep hematoma on the left side of his skull, inconsistent with the fall. The injury suggested he had been struck in the head before going through the window. The official cause of death was never changed. The case was never reopened as a homicide. Frank Olson's son Eric has spent the rest of his life saying publicly that his father was murdered by the CIA to prevent him from talking. No one has ever proven him wrong. By the early 1960s, the program was beginning to unravel from the inside. LSD had proven to be ungovernable. Its effects were too unpredictable, too varied, too dependent on the individual mind to be weaponized with any reliability. Gottlieb eventually acknowledged this in Senate testimony, describing the results as inconsistent and the program's core goal as never achieved. But the admission came quietly, internally, far from public view. And by then, the program had already left thousands of broken people in its wake. In 1963, the CIA's own Inspector General conducted an internal review of MKUltra and emerged visibly disturbed. His report identified illegal and unethical practices and recommended that non-consensual testing be immediately halted. But the concern in his report was not primarily moral. A surviving memo from that period states explicitly that if these activities became publicly known, they would cause serious damage to the credibility of the agency. They were not afraid of what had been done to people. They were afraid of being seen doing it. Here is the number that defines this phase of the story. By the time MKUltra was quietly being wound down, the program had operated through at least 150 separate sub-projects. 150. Each one a distinct line of experimentation. We have documentation for a fraction of them. The content of the majority was destroyed before any investigator could read it. In 1972, Sidney Gottlieb retired from the CIA. In 1973, outgoing CIA Director Richard Helms gave the order: shred everything. The machines ran for days. Files documenting 20 years of human experimentation, thousands of subjects, dozens of institutions, multiple countries, all of it was reduced to nothing. It was one of the most deliberate destructions of evidence in the history of the United States government. But one set of documents survived. A financial archive had been misfiled in a separate records facility. 700 pages that the shredding order never reached. In 1977, a researcher pursuing a Freedom of Information Act request found them. That discovery forced CIA Director Stansfield Turner to appear before a Senate committee. He confirmed the program. He confirmed the non-consensual drugging. He said he was appalled. He said the agency would try to identify the victims. They never did. The Senate investigation concluded that a full accounting of MKUltra's victims was impossible because the records were gone. Most of the people who were experimented on never knew what had been done to them. Many had spent years or decades in psychiatric institutions, their minds altered by experiments they had no memory of agreeing to. The United States government acknowledged the program, accepted a portion of responsibility, settled some lawsuits, and moved on. The people who ran it were never criminally charged. Sidney Gottlieb died in 1999 at the age of 80. He had spent his retirement gardening, writing poetry, and volunteering at a hospice for the dying. He was never prosecuted. Not one person connected to MKUltra ever served a single day in prison. There are questions about MKUltra that have no answers. Not because the answers do not exist somewhere, but because the men who had them are dead, or silent, or made sure that any document containing them was destroyed before the world could read it. What we are left with is a confirmed program, a partial record, and a silence where the worst parts of the truth used to be. Subproject 54 is one of the most disturbing examples of what we do not know. This project was run not by the CIA, but by the United States Navy. Its goal, described in the surviving financial records, was to develop what planners called the perfect concussion, the use of precisely calibrated sound frequencies below the threshold of human hearing to erase memory completely and without physical trace. The funding records exist. The project name exists. What the project actually did, who it was tested on, and what results were obtained does not exist. The documentation was destroyed. We know it happened. We know nothing about what happened inside it. In Montreal, Canada, a psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron was secretly funded by the CIA through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Cameron was conducting what he called psychic driving experiments at a respected Montreal hospital. He would place patients into drug-induced unconscious states lasting weeks at a time. While they were unconscious, he would play recorded messages on a continuous loop, sometimes repeating the same statement tens of thousands of times, attempting to strip away the patient's existing personality and replace it with new psychological content. These were not prisoners or criminals. These were Canadian citizens who had voluntarily checked into a hospital for treatment of depression, anxiety, and mild neurological conditions. Some of them lost the ability to recognize their own families. Some lost entire years of their lives. Some never recovered any functional sense of self. Canada and the United States both funded these experiments. Neither country has ever issued a formal apology to those victims or their families. Here is what may be the most significant fact in this entire story. The techniques developed and refined under MKUltra did not stay in the 1950s and 1960s. They were documented, preserved in some form, and reappeared decades later. After September 11, 2001, CIA black sites operating in Thailand, Poland, Romania, and other locations used methods that investigators and former detainees described with language that matched MKUltra documentation almost exactly. Prolonged sensory deprivation, forced sleep disruption over days and weeks, psychological isolation designed to produce complete disorientation, pharmacological manipulation. These methods appeared in a CIA interrogation manual that became public years later. The logic that drove Sidney Gottlieb in 1953 was still present in a secret room in 2002. The names changed, the classification levels changed, the philosophy did not. MKUltra officially ended. The paperwork says 1973. The Senate hearings say it was shut down. But consider one final thought before you leave this video. This program ran for 20 years without any member of the public knowing it existed. It operated through more than 150 sub-projects, inside 30 universities, across multiple countries, funded through fake foundations and false identities. It cost the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. It involved some of the highest levels of the United States government, and it was only discovered because of one misfiled box in the wrong room. If something like this could exist and operate and grow and expand for 20 years without being seen, what would prevent a version of it from existing right now under a different name in a building with no public address, with all of its paperwork already written in a language that will never be declassified in our lifetimes? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the question this channel was built to ask. Drop your thoughts and theories in the comments below. Tell us what you believe really happened to the victims whose names were never recorded. Tell us what you think was in the files that burned. Like this video if this investigation matters to you. Subscribe to Lost Beyond Sight, because we are not done asking questions that powerful people would prefer you never think about.